We ask that all audience members hold their questions until the end of the seminar. We'll open the floor for discussion at the end of the presentation. Please welcome me in joining Mr. Duncan Steele.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Nicole. And thanks to the IHE, thanks folks for inviting me to be here today and share some of what I do at AHS and how I do it. So just the clicker? Okay, terrific. First, I want to do a kind of an overview of what the role is. AHS is relatively new. It started about exactly 1 year ago. And then get into a little bit about the kind of conceptually or philosophically how I see ethics fitting into decision-making in healthcare. And then we'll go into process-wise, how to actually bring that into operationalize, bring that into action, bringing values into decision-making explicitly. So first off, the Organizational Ethics Office at AHS, there's kind of two main, it's an office of one, it's me so far. But there's two main functions. One is around resource allocation prioritization, so supporting the executive team and other teams within AHS when they're making decisions. Sometimes it's budget decisions, so resource allocation type things. Sometimes it's prioritization, so where to put services, that sort of thing. As well as the organizational ethics consultations, which is more supporting teams in coming up with policy level decisions. Often they're kind of that formal level of decision, sometimes more informal than that, strategic planning or decision making at a unit level, that kind of thing. Some distinctions that I like to give, and they may not be as helpful for you, but might be helpful for folks on the line, is that there's different ethics teams within AHS. And so I'm part of this top one, the clinical ethics consult team has the same executive director. What they do, there's about 11 or 12 clinical ethicists within AHS, and what they do is really around supporting decision making at the bedside. So a lot of it tends to be around care planning with patients and working through difficult decision making in that context. And then organizational ethics tends to be at a system level, so it's looking at groups of patients, business decisions, that kind of thing. And then ethics compliance is another team within AHS, and their scope is supporting staff, physicians, and so on to understand how to comply with the AHS governance standards or governance documents like the whistleblower regulations, conflict of interest, that sort of thing. I find that this is helpful to share with folks. When I start talking about what I do, it's helpful to share some examples of the types of work. So this is kind of a cross-section of some of the types of projects I've been involved in the past couple of years or so. So it varies from issues around sharing of information, so confidentiality in MHSU and understanding the college requirements and legislative changes, right through to pandemic planning, supply chain disruption, isotope shortage planning, which is really around that prioritization, resource allocation type thing, where we're trying to develop criteria as well as processes for who's going to do what, when, and what are the criteria that they're going to follow to make decisions when there's disruptions. And right through to sexual health and intimacy in residential care, which is one I worked on in BC, and then they're going on right now in Alberta as well. So big scope. I put this in, it's kind of meant to be cheeky, tongue-in-cheek, but I did, when I first started working in ethics, this was a question that sometimes I would get, kind of, what is that about? What the heck is ethics anyway? And some of the funnier ones, or funnier perspectives for things like this, oh, it sounds like something for old guys with leather-bound books in an ivory tower. It's not really related to what I do, especially as a clinician. It's really important. That sounds really important. Ethics is really important, but and reasonably, but my priority is really around patient care, and I'm overloaded. I'm really charting through the roof. I don't have time to add this extra ingredient into my work or this extra work task into my workload. And the piece that I want to stress is that. And it's relevant to health economists as well, especially for clinicians, but health economists as well, is it's in everything you do. It's in your actions, it's in your attitude, it's in the decisions you make, and it's based on your beliefs about kind of what's true in the world and your beliefs about what's important in what you do. So the piece I want to stress here is that it really is already part of your day-to-day. And I think as health economists in the room, you get that already because there's a lot of ethics involved in economics and analysis. So section 3, facts, values, and emotions. This is really, I want to stress the kind of foundations, as I was saying, the kind of conceptual foundations of how I look at bringing ethics into decision making in real life. And some of this is a little bit fun, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but just to, we can have a little fun with ethics too. It doesn't have to be serious all the time.
Again, this is the USS Montana requesting that you immediately divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Over.
Please divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid collision.
This is Captain Hancock. You will divert your course. Over.
Negative, Captain. I'm not moving anything. Change your course. Over.
Sir, this is the USS Montana, the second largest vessel in the North Atlantic Fleet. You will change course 15 degrees north, or I will be forced to take measures to ensure the safety of this ship. Over.
This is a lighthouse, mate. It's your call. Hello, Captain? I think he's gone. Fair enough.
So we'll just switch back to the slides here. And this is the kind of the takeaway there is that, and this isn't rocket science. It's if we don't have good information, we're not going to be able to make good decisions. And I think that's probably pretty relevant to all of your day-to-day work. Well, but I want to say a little bit more about the facts or information, which is kind of that first pillar, that first foundational piece of how to make good decisions or ethically justified decisions in healthcare. And this slide it's kind of busy and it's meant to be a little bit busy. It's because our beliefs about what's true in the world actually often aren't as clear as we think they are, as we'd like them to be. And they change day to day. So as we go forward in time, they change. And there's kind of a range of what we believe to be true, where there's things that are kind of closer to matters of interpretation or esoteric kind of beliefs around what's the purpose of life, what happens when we die. And then you can see on the other side coming back down as kind of things as we get closer to the bottom are more kind of objective truths or scientific truths. So what's the risk ratio for the drug for this population, this given population? Is this milk gone bad? It's pretty much a binary. That was a joke. But the piece one of the pieces I want you to take away from this is that often as we kind of go through life, there's lots of beliefs we have about the world that we take as given and we take as truths, and sometimes that makes it hard to unpack that. And so when we're in a difficult, complex decision-making context, sometimes it's difficult to kind of break those apart and figure out where is there stuff that we have good evidence for, where is there stuff that we might have to make assumptions about, and where is there stuff that there isn't going to be a lot of evidence about, but it's still in healthcare really, really important. What are our beliefs about these types of things? What's the meaning of life? What does a good life look like? That sort of thing. And just before I go to the next slide, I'll just kind of preface as we're looking forward. Because of that and the kind of variance in belief and what different interpretations of reality is, not to get too philosophical, but that's one of the reasons it's so important to have or to be careful about who's at the table in making decisions. Because other people will push us in ways that we didn't realize that we've made assumptions about. I'll say more about that in a bit. And now we'll switch to a video, and this one's more about values, so kind of what's important.
What? Oh, I can't believe that just happened.
I cannot believe that just happened.
This was gonna be our thing.
What are you doing?
We made a pact. You watched ahead.
No? Okay, I watched it on my way to work, caught some episodes at my desk, and I started season 2 while you were sleeping.
Season 2?
Netflix, TV shows and movies at your command for $8 a month, but please, watch responsibly.
Are you crying?
So I like this one because I can relate to it because I do this. But the reason I share that is thinking about kind of, so what's important to him, what's important to her. They have these values, they've made this commitment. But something for her, it seems like, probably binge watching the show, it sounds like, is more important to her than the time that they'd agreed to share. watching it together, the shared experience of it, and so on. Anyways, just a funny thing to keep in mind, the values piece. And so this is the second pillar, or the second kind of foundational piece, that no matter how hard we work, and even if we get the facts right, even if we don't get the facts right, this is the wrong slide. The takeaway here is, let me just see if, we went backwards, terrific. Is that in all of our actions, we're showing the world what's important to us. And so she was showing, or she was living her values. And maybe she wasn't living with integrity the way that she would have liked, or her ideal for herself, but she was showing what was important to her in the moment and through her actions. And so I want to, or kind of sticking with values, but shifting gears a little bit, it's just thinking about where do values come from when I'm talking about values, because there's lots of different ways to interpret that or conceptualize it. And I'll just start with where do they actually come from. And in the kind of the work that I do, or when I'm leading teams in healthcare to do to make decisions, there's lots of places where values are coming from that are and they're all valid. And so they come from places like your backgrounds as health economists. There's certain values that come in the field that kind of are embedded within the culture of being a health economist, in the same way that there's certain specialties. So surgeons have certain things that are quite important to them because of the culture, because of the kind of nature of their work, versus a community physician will have different things that are, they might have the same values but have different prioritizations even. And as if you can see from the back, so there's lots of different places: society, family, geography, faith communities, health regions too. It's a little different in Alberta where we have a single health region, but even within the zones, there's slightly different things that we weigh as important. And again, in terms of kind of how to conceptualize values, I thought this is a useful one coming at it from the perspective of health economics. And I just wanted, this is one way of looking at values, is you can look at them as instrumental versus intrinsic values. So instrumental values being values that get you to something else. They're instrumental in getting you somewhere. They're a conditional value that's going to get you to something else that's really good. And then intrinsic values are inherently good. So things like respect for human dignity or respect for others. It doesn't really get anything except it's the end in itself, rather than a means to an end. And you might have heard some language I'm saying there. So going back to your studies around utilitarianism, consequentialism, which is on the left-hand side here, and then more along the lines of deontology, Kantian deontology on the right-hand side, which is kind of things for their own sake. And then we'll switch gears one more time. I saw some people taking notes. I think there's going to be some hard questions about the values piece coming. So we want to switch gears and just last video just for a little fun, and then we'll get into the process. And this one I want you to think about kind of what are the emotions or what's important here that's going on.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless, and I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
Yeah, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep...
Yeah, so the takeaway there that I'm hoping that you grabbed is that sometimes we come into a situation and the answer seems really obvious to us, I'd say even often, because we have all of the people around this table bring a lot of expertise, experience to the context. Sometimes you need to meet people where they're at, and you need to work through kind of that check-in of how am I feeling emotionally, how are others around feeling, because before that's kind of handled, or before you work through that, I should say, you can't get to having kind of deep conversations about the facts and the values, because there's still lots of emotion. And another thing I'll just say as a takeaway is often strong emotions are a sign. They're kind of a flag for us to say there's something going on here. There's some values behind this. So if I'm feeling really frustrated, something's going on in this context that's not living up to my values. So the takeaway here, and I'll probably say this a couple more times in the presentation, but the takeaway from all of this is that there's facts and values, and those are what guide good decisions. And just having the facts alone isn't enough, and just having the values alone isn't enough either. And so what we're trying to get at is as good of an understanding, the best understanding of the information in the context possible. And the reason I say best is because sometimes the context is a very short time frame or very low resources. So there aren't kind of the people to go find that information, or kind of as much information as we'd like. So we have to work within those constraints, but we have to do the best we can within those constraints. And then the values piece is around finding that shared understanding of what's important in the context. The reason I say shared is because really that is, in my opinion, how values are found, and how we find what's important in a context is through dialogue. It's not me sitting alone in a leather-bound chair, smoking a pipe, thinking about what's important. It's me working with a group and asking for different people what their perspectives are, because the decision's probably going to impact lots of people, not just me. This is a second takeaway, and I often say to people, if there's only one thing that you remember from the presentation, other than the funny videos, this is, literally though, if there was only one thing that you took away, I'd suggest it's this. It's, people often ask kind of, because we're gonna, in a few slides from now, I'm gonna start walking through a case study and show you kind of process-wise how to work through a difficult context and bring values and bring facts into the decisions. It can be quite time intensive. But it doesn't have to be. This is kind of the very most boiled down version of the process, where it's just a check-in. And I suggest to people, so I think there are some clinicians in the room, I suggest to clinicians, this is even a check-in you can do in the moment quite quickly if you're rounding on patients and that sort of thing, is just to check and say, do we have a shared understanding of the facts around this context? And if not, how are we going to get there? What's our plan for getting them? And do we have a shared understanding of what's important in the context and how to address whatever the decision is that needs to be made? And if not, how are we going to get there? And then finally, and maybe it actually should be first, I maybe have misordered this, is how am I feeling and how are the other people feeling? Because we're going to have to address those emotions, and they may be telling us important things about the context so that we can get to making a good decision, the best decision possible. Section 4, bringing values into practice. So here I'm going to switch gears, as I mentioned, and start talking about the process for actually structuring decision-making, or how I structure decision-making with teams to bring values explicitly into decisions. And I keep saying bring values into decisions. It's bringing more than just values, I think you're hearing. But that's the piece I'd say that's most unique about this process. You'll see, you may see, depending on your familiarity with different models, some aspects of the PMP, I just forgot the name, but the PMP PMBOK. You might see some aspects of like ProSci, change management type things in here. And you might see other types of things, policy analysis, policy, decision analysis type models. You might see ingredients of there, because lots of these models have good aspects to them. The piece that they don't often bring up, and definitely not as explicitly as this, is the values step. And so that's why I keep coming back to it and stressing it, is that's the really unique piece. What you see here is a long list. We don't have time to get into all of it, and I don't think it would be that interesting either. But this piece coming through kind of steps 1 through 9, and I'll really stress the kind of 4 and 5, which are around the values pieces, which are the kind of most unique to the model compared to others. Sorry, some lights just went off, and back on. That was the look on my face. So. as I was saying, I'm going to walk us through a case study, and how I've structured it is there's a slide. There'll be a slide. For the most part, there'll be a slide where I explain the step in the process, and then there'll be a slide where I explain what happened in the case. And it's a real life case. I've taken it's fairly paraphrased and pared down, but hopefully will be illustrative. So this one is around supply chain disruptions in BC, and was a framework that I co-led with Berna Marcellino, who some of you might be familiar with, who's the provincial director for supply chain in BC. And some of the things that were going on, these are kind of some of the complexities and gaps, is that, well, supply chains are quite complex. They're arguably much more complex nowadays than they were in the past. There was a sense that the severity and frequency of disruptions were increasing. Natural disasters and extreme weather conditions seem to be increasing as well. And so at the time, the hurricane that had hit Puerto Rico and done a lot of damage to Puerto Rico, actually, as it happened, had some impact on supply chain around some medical products for BC and other places in Canada and North America. And then another piece of complexity is that within BC, the supply chain is broken down in different ways because we have 5 geographic health authorities and one, I shouldn't say we, I used to work in BC, so as you might have picked up, is they have 5 geographic health authorities, regional ones, and then 1 provincial. And within those, there's a provincial level of supply chain. There's also health authority levels where they do their own purchasing, direct purchase. And then there's also site level where there's some direct purchase and there's some kind of variance or differences in how inventory is done and logistics are handled and stuff, and historical things. There's just a lot of complexity. The context or the scope was around medical products excluding pharmaceuticals. So this was things, everything from like diagnostic products, so I mean like technetium-9 through to saline solution or saline bags, where we had that shortage last year. And that was where this was actually piloted on. And through to kind of things that seem quite mundane but can have a big impact, like sippy cups for patients, that sort of thing. So it was a big spectrum, which added some complexity too, because you need to have a process and values criteria that apply to all. So the blue, I don't know how helpful it's going to be. They're color coded. Blue is the framework and orange is the case study. But I'll remind us as we go. So the first step in the process, and I was thinking maybe I shouldn't even talk about this stuff because it's mundane, but it's so critical to good decisions, even though it's not kind of explicitly ethics stuff or philosophical stuff. It's really, really critical getting this right. And why it's really critical is thinking carefully about who should be around the table. So who should be around the table at what times, who should be consulted with later on in the process, and how do you find that balance of having the right mix of people, but not too many people at the table either, because partly logistically, you can imagine having, say, 40 people in a room is quite difficult and getting everyone together. It's also a lot of resource demand where it adds a lot of people's time to ask for. But it's also, in terms of process-wise, it's really difficult for everyone to be heard and play a part in the decision-making and be really engaged, which means that it's kind of a waste, that if we invite a lot of people and then aren't able to make the time, create this time and space for them to be involved, it means that they're not having a chance to contribute their own perspective on the facts, their own perspective on what's important in the context. So it's really, really critical. It also it can be problematic if we're too narrow in how many people, or the types of people who are around the table. So if we I'll just pick on myself, if we put a bunch of ethicists around the table and said, solve this supply chain issue, it's not going to go that well because we're missing a bunch of key expertise, right? It makes sense. So step 2, and this is taken from the actual case. Sorry, it's really wordy. I'll translate it, I'll boil it down. It's basically the key question step is also really critical, and I often see it not happening in working groups. And that's basically checking in and saying, what are we trying to do, and what's the scope? What's the gap that we're trying to fill? And in this case, there were 3, and this often happens, I'll say, in kind of prioritization context, is there were 3 questions, basically. I only put 2 of them up because one of them's not that interesting, but it's basically the process. How are we going to do this thing? How are we going to approach supply disruptions in BC. So process-wise, criteria also. So what are the criteria that we're going to use, or what should the criteria be that we use to prioritize if it comes to a case where we need to prioritize between different groups, different sites or health authorities. And then finally, who. So who is going to actually be the person or the people, it wasn't one person, the people who are going to be involved in using this process and these criteria. Step 3 in the process is about gathering information. Sometimes I think I've probably called it facts, kind of facts and values, and in some ways that's unfair because, as I said in that early slide, that was kind of really busy, and I was saying there's kind of esoteric to scientific. There's this range of information. So step 3 is around really gathering the information as best as we can. You're probably really well acquainted with this. It's a normal thing that we're quite used to doing in decision making, is getting the best information we can. That being said, I think you can probably also relate to being involved in groups making decisions where the kind of time and space isn't made for us to interact with each other, for me to say, this is what I think is going on, and for you to check in and say, actually, Duncan, that doesn't jive with my understanding. Here's what I think, and for us to develop a shared understanding. Often it's kind of talking over each other and not checking in to make sure that that kind of interpersonal communication gap is being closed. The other 2 things are just identifying missing information, pretty straightforward, and assumptions, is that sometimes we're going to have to make assumptions and operate with assumptions. I don't think that's probably a surprise to folks around the table, but this pushes the group to say, let's name those assumptions very clearly. And partly the reason we name them is to be transparent about the decision making, but also so that when we engage with others outside of the decision-making group, that they can weigh in and say, oh, we actually have that information, or that isn't an assumption you have to make, that exists. Step 3, this is the information step, but for the case study, this is just really high level. So there's, as I mentioned, there's 6 health authorities. Sometimes the disruptions were causing a lot of long-term service delivery challenges. There's the scarcity in itself prompted the observation that we needed some kind of framework for approaching this consistently and transparently and in a well thought out way. So that's just really high level. There's pages and pages of in the working document. Step 4, shifting gears, and this is the start of the pieces that I really want to stress and spend a bit of time. Yeah, we have some time to chat about, or I'll chat and then we'll talk about afterwards once I'm done, I think, is the setup. But step 4, values. So as I mentioned, sources of values. The way that I elicit values in this process is quite organic. There's a term, naturalized bioethics. There's a reference for that at the end of the slide deck if you're interested. Naturalized bioethics, which is basically, to paraphrase probably badly, it's saying that folks bring their own expertise and they bring understandings of what's important in either that context of their expertise or the context of their lives. So we don't need to depend on an ethicist like myself to come in and tell you, here's what's important in the context, or here's what you should value, though that is part of the process. But this recognizes that people, as I was saying, you're already doing this, you know things that are important. When you have those emotional reactions, it's telling you something's important to you. Process-wise, often this actually just looks like a conversation, like a facilitated conversation, where I say, okay, so we've talked about the context and some of the information about what's going on there. Now, what's important to you about how we answer those 3 key questions? So the process, what the criteria are in the process, and then who's going to do the actual work. And and you might have picked up, I was implying they're separate. So those are different bundles of values because the nature of the questions are different. One thing I'll stress, so these are kind of practical advice that I'm trying to give, is one thing I stress is it really needs to be clear because you're trying to create a shared understanding. So if someone says, for example, autonomy or respect for autonomy is really important. Yes, it absolutely is. But around the table of kind of 20 or so of us here today, I would imagine there's at least 20 different understandings of what that means. And so at least 20 different understandings of what it means to live up to that value, like what a decision would look like if it lived up to that value. So we really boil down into more plain language and action guiding language. I'll show you some examples when we get a little further here. It's also important because in the next step, the working group prioritizes. And so if I'm asking someone to prioritize, they need to understand what they're prioritizing, what they're ranking. Skip ahead. So here's some examples. It's just 4. I think there were probably something like 20 or so for in terms of values around what the process should look like. I just noted, so I didn't take the criteria, I'm not showing you the criteria values because it's not as interesting to see the process, because the criteria values are just kind of, here's the values. But there's no then analysis. I'll say more about that when we get to it. Maybe it's going too deep dive, too fast. So here's some examples. I won't get into all of them. I'll read one. It's important that we maintain and support best standards of practice in patient care. And in the actual working documents, often it's richer than that. So this is kind of a boiled down version that we use for the prioritization. We're at the end of the prioritization. But often there's examples in there that flesh it out and that sort of thing. The key, as I was saying, is that these are they're obviously action guiding, I guess is one way to put it. That around the table, people have the same understanding of what they mean and what it would mean for a decision to live up to it. So what it would look like if the process was living up to the value. You're a really quiet audience. Not a lot of feedback coming back.
We'll towards the end. We're not quiet. Let me show you.
Psyching me out. So step 5 is prioritization. So the actual act of, now we have these lists of values for the process and for the criteria and for who should be involved in what ways. It's often, at Fraser it was often in-person meetings. In AHS it's less often in-person meetings, but in between the meetings there would be some time where I would then ask folks who are involved to rank all of these. Or rank might be the wrong way of framing it. Give a grade might be a better way of framing it. And I'll just say a little more to flesh that out, is basically I send you the way that I like best, that works well, is sending out a survey that has all the values, explains a little bit about what the ask is, and then individually each person looks through those and gives between a score of 5 to 1. Sometimes we'll also include 0 if there's things on there where we think they're probably just going to get knocked off, that they're not important, that they're just there to kind of push the dialogue so that we have a shared understanding of what should be involved and not in terms of values. I think that probably made sense, but just to say one last thing. So 5 being, because you'll see it in a sec when I show you some scores, so 5 being really important, that someone's saying this is one of the most important values, and you could rank all of them as 5s. If it wouldn't be really helpful, super helpful for the process, but you're allowed, that's fine. But you do need to have a rationale. That's the other thing, is as you're doing these rankings solo, I'm asking folks, think about why this is more or less important relative to the other values. And that, I guess, is another piece I might say too much. It's just relative to the other values. So it's not saying universally this is the most important thing. It's saying in this context, within this list, what's the most important to you and why. So then we come and so I get all those back, I compile them, and basically I'll show you a document in a sec, compile all the scores up, and then just rank from highest score to lowest score, so which is equivalent to highest priority to lowest priority. And we look at that overall ordering, and I check in and say, how is this landing on folks? Are there things that you think should be higher or lower? And if there are, what's your rationale for that? What's your argument for it? And then also there's some that I'll have picked out where either one of two things has happened. Is there's been, say, a bunch of people ranked it a 5 and someone ranked it a 3 or a 2. So there's some variance there, and we could just average it out at 4.9 something, but that doesn't really reflect what's going on, which is that someone in the group doesn't agree or has a different understanding of what that value means. So it's a flag to me to say, because we don't want to just average it out and then say, okay, we use this kind of loosey-goosey method and came to a score and it's quantifiable, so great. It's really because what we're trying to do is build that shared understanding of what's important. because the final bullet point here is what's going on in that actual conversation is we're building the rationale for the decision. So we're building the rationale that we will then share with people outside of this room. So people who we engage with when we're consulting, or in the policy document or the prioritization framework, to say here's our understanding of what was most important, and here's the reasons why. So that you're not just getting what sometimes happens is a document that comes and says here's the decision, here's the policy, and for all you know, it was made by someone like me off in an office by themselves. You don't know what went into it, and so you don't know if you can trust it sometimes. So this is, as I was alluding to, what it looks like when that score comes back. So everyone's done their individual rankings and it comes back. I'll just kind of explain because it's kind of small text. So here's the value statements on the left-hand side. Here are the scores that individuals gave, and the averages, and then notes on rationale. The notes on rationale here is empty. This is what it would look like if I'd come back to you and now we were going to have that conversation and have that step. And I'd say, how does that land? And Chris might say, oh, I think the value of our limiting negative impacts on patient safety in our choices of products actually should be higher. And here's why. And then he'd share his argument with the rest of the group. And we'd have some dialogue, whether people agreed or not. And as that dialogue's happening, usually me or someone else who's one of the facilitators in the meeting would be capturing the arguments that were being said, because that's where we're getting that rich rationale for why this might be a high value or a lower value. Does that make sense? Okay. So this isn't actually from the case, but it illustrates it well. I probably shouldn't have said that. This is basically the product that comes out of that conversation. In just as it happens in this example with supply chain disruption, we didn't need to do this because we basically did it in person. But this is really a really useful way of structuring and bringing values basically into life, where I'll just explain what it is, and then I'll give you an example where we did use it. So what you see again, values on the left-hand side. Priority, so they're kind of highest, there's a medium down there, so just highest to lowest. Usually how that's done, I hope this isn't too complex, or is what we'll do is sort of arbitrarily, we'll look at the scores and we'll say, okay, everything between a 5 and a 4 or a 4.2, we're kind of eyeballing it, will be our top priority. Like, we're saying they're really important, but for the sake of this, we might say everything between a 5 and a 4.2 is number one priority, and everything between a 4.2 down to a 3, say, is kind of medium, and then everything else below that is important, and we want to live up to it, but we are going to prioritize the ones above, if that makes sense. So the trickiness there, and the reason I said arbitrary, and arbitrary is probably not the right word, is what's going on there is if there's values that have been ranked really high, and so it's evident to us that they're a high priority and this decision ought to live up to them unless there's a very good reason not to, forcing us not to. And then where you'd have that kind of second tier is ones that are ranked high but are in conflict with something above. So that's another piece that I didn't get into as much as I should have maybe in the previous step, is that when I'm looking at kind of, I said I flag when there's kind of disagreement. I also flag where if there are values that are ranked about the same, but they're actually going to be ones we can't necessarily live up to. So in this situation, I can't remember if this was exactly the case, so I'm kind of making this up. But bear with me, is like, let's say cost and patient quality of care. Those are ones that are often, in terms of a resource allocation decision, are often in tension, where in some contexts we're not going to be able to live up to both. But we need to they're both really important, and we need to have a good rationale for why we would say one's more important than the other. That makes sense? Okay. And then I'll just give you an example of where this has worked really well is, I think you're kind of hearing my implication that I want you to be able to take stuff away from this process into your own day-to-day work, where you're not depending on pulling in an ethicist to act as an expert or guide, though it is useful. This is a really useful way of structuring those values to bring them into the decision making, where I think the first time that we used this was with the Ebola planning management, EOC, like emergency operation committee stuff that was going on quite a few years ago now. And as it happened, luckily there were no big outbreaks, but as we were planning for them, the public health, is it the chief public, the medical public health officer, anyways, the top public health folks for BC found this really useful to use even independently. So I and one of my colleagues were quite involved early on in coming up, eliciting the values with one of the working groups, and then they actually took this away and found that they could use it independent of us as a kind of check-in. So they'd say, okay, we need to say, for example, just for example, hey, we need a policy for family visitation of people with suspected or confirmed cases of Ebola in not going to say the right word, but quarantine. What's our policy going to be? And they could draft up a policy, kind of here's what we think should happen, and then check against this, and just go through the list and say, okay, is it going to live up to this number one value? Yes, no, maybe, or maybe it's not applicable. And so yes, if it's a high ranked value, great, then you're on the right track. No, if it's a high ranked value, that's a flag to say, hey, you might need to tweak something in your decision, in your proposed policy. So only if would say, well, only if we can get the resources for extra PPE for this unit, then we'll be able to do this policy. This column is just, as it says, capturing those changes. So it's really straight. I've seen people use it mostly without my help. So me just kind of as an observer, and it worked really well. So I guess what I want you to take away from that is that you can bring ethics into decision making, and it doesn't have to be kind of super difficult or super complex. It can be boiled down into something fairly straightforward and very action guiding. This is the final slide about the process stuff. I've kind of conflated a bunch of last steps into it because I don't think we need to go through the details. So basically, you draft the decision, building on those pillars or those foundations of the fact, your best information and your shared understanding what's important. You do the analysis, so like going through the checklist or going through your prioritized list of values, does it live up to the things that it ought to? And if not, tweak it, and then you go out and you consult on it. And that's a really important step to that engagement outside of the group. And if you want to put it in the language of this process, you want to make sure you have the best information. You want to make sure that you've got the values right. And you also want to make sure that the decision that you're putting forward is actually going to have the impacts that you're hoping it does. So it needs to go out to other people, other stakeholders, other people with perspective on the context. There's other values in there too, like respect for others, who a decision might impact, and that sort of thing. There's also other process values in terms of like recursiveness. I think you're hearing is that this process is meant to be open to change, that you're not trying to carve a statue and it's perfect and it's done and you leave it. It's meant to be flexible and open to change. And here's just a few references. So Bashir Jawani, Ethically Justified Decisions in Health Management Forum from a few years ago, that outlines a lot of what I was talking about. This is my previous boss at Fraser Health. The Widdershoven et al., that's talking about the kind of naturalized bioethics and around kind of the dialogical process of developing shared understandings of what's important. And then this Janice Stein is a really old book from her lecture, one of the Massey lectures, but I thought I'd just throw it in because I did get a lot out of it when I read it, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. And it's from, you can see 2002, so it's back when there was a lot of discourse around kind of this targeting efficiency, but then not actually carefully thinking about, well, what are we going to do once we're more efficient? What are we going to do with the marginal benefits or the marginal savings, that sort of thing. So anyway, I don't actually know if it's good anymore. I read it like 10 years ago, so it might be awful. So don't hold me to that one. But I think I remember being great. So thanks very much, everyone, for bearing with me through that. And I think we have some time for some online questions first, and then questions from the room.
I'll just pop up to it.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, Duncan, for your presentation. It was really wonderful. We're going to open up for discussion to the online participants first. We will keep it rolling, so anybody online that wants to stick around is welcome to. They can listen to the discussion that happens in the room. We're gonna cut it off after the online questions and then go to the in-person questions.
Terrific. Nicole, are there any online questions yet? rolling in after that.
Yeah, they'll come up in the chat.
Oh,
okay. Asking a question.
I'm asking the question. Are there questions?
Maybe take it in room while you wait for
online. Absolutely. Throw me some softballs first, just to warm up, if it's all right. I'm looking at you, Ken. No, I don't think you have any softballs. I don't want to start with you.
So you're identifying a whole range of values. I think when you have a large group of stakeholders, they're going to identify a lot of different kinds of values in these kinds of conversations. So epistemic values, aesthetic values, process values, as well as moral values.
Sure, yeah.
So in your process, are you trying to distinguish between those and separate them and focus solely on one particular kind of value, or are you naming them for people?
Yeah.
How are you dealing with all of that?
For sure. Thanks. So it's not, we don't go as, or I'll say, I don't go as complex as like the paper that you have with Bjorn and Lars, with the table of all the different categorizations of values. And it might be a pragmatic thing, or it might be that I'm not that smart with values, it just turns out. Is that there's process values. Broadly, I break it down as there's process values and then there's substantive values. There's values about the process, like how we're doing the thing. And as you heard, part of this case study was developing a process. And there's also, they're related, they often are overlap. There's kind of these meta process values about how are we creating the process with this ethics decision-making framework. So you heard me talk about recursiveness and respect and transparency and that sort of thing. So I separate them only that much, so not in a very complex way. And then there's substantive values. So what is it? So the criteria that actually guide the decisions when there is a shortage, those are, I would call, substantive. They're giving substantial guidance, whereas the process ones are more about how we do the thing. Yeah. How did that land on you?
I think it started to address it. I mean, people will raise values around evidence, so certain scientific values which may not be moral. And so I guess you build those into the process because you're trying to have decisions that live up to those sorts of values as well, not just explicitly moral values. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure if this is what you're trying to get at, but in terms of the kind of evidence gathering, where there's values embedded in the ways that we gather evidence, and you all, I think, know that better than I do in terms of whether we're using qualies or is it dailies, dollies. So you definitely know better than I do. But there's values embedded in those framings, and so we pull in information as kind of facts. And if it was stuff that needed to be named, then I think we'd name it in the moment. But it's not stuff I don't think that would get brought out in the values that are meant to be guiding the decision.
Okay.
Not as much. It could happen. Yeah.
No, thanks. That's right. Thank you.
I think, Chris, you look like you have a question.
Very warm, not very low softball type thing.
I didn't think it would. I was hoping someone else would ask a question.
So,
please.
In our world, where we're always thinking about prioritizing limited resources, an argument could be made that it's a false dichotomy between the instrumental and the intrinsic value.
Okay.
Because how you choose to allocate those limited resources is impacting upon the expression of the intrinsic values more or less to different people or different organizations that you're trying to serve. So the idea of efficiency is meaningless without the specification of the intrinsic value that is driving what your target output is. And so when people say efficiency is a value, no, it's not. So to say that there's a tension between pursuing efficiency and pursuing maximum social good, whatever that is actually a false dichotomy.
Okay.
Until you have agreed on what your intrinsic values that you're trying to pursue are, you can't define efficiency. You can't say whether something is efficient or inefficient. But surely once you know what your intrinsic values are, you want to be efficient in the production of that.
Yeah.
And so I often, in these sorts of discussions, when people talk about efficiency as inherently utilitarian, they're just demonstrating they don't know what efficiency is.
Okay.
They think it's something that exists out with an objective, and that objective actually exists only as an expression, an operationalization of an intrinsic value.
Okay.
And so I think it makes it easy for us to say we don't like things, because, oh, you're just being efficient. But who wants to be inefficient in the production of things we value? You know?
Yeah, I think I hear you, and yeah, that's an interesting point. I'm glad you brought it up. I hadn't thought of it that way. I'm not sure we disagree as much as.
No, I just think that when in the ethics community,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people sort of take this as read as this thing about efficiency, and I think it damages the quality of the processes that are then pursued, because it's assumed that efficiency is in tension with the intrinsic goods that we're pursuing.
Okay.
I don't think you can define efficiency without having established what the intrinsic goods are.
That's a really nice point. Great. I'm not going to argue with you because yeah, thanks for raising that. I hadn't thought of it that way. Maybe if I thought about it a bit longer, not on my feet, I'd have something to say back or more of a response. Okay, but yeah,
not meant to be
a
criticism. It's just.
No, thank you for sharing that with all of us. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe this is more of a softball question. But so I was just thinking about your scoring system when you're choosing the values. So I guess I find it hard. Like if you don't ask people to make explicit choices about which things so economists would want to make people choose
a trade-off
over the other.
Yep.
We don't want to be saying you can answer 5 to everything. I guess what I'm curious about is when you're looking at the scoring these sorts of things and ranking them, when you say taking an average, how do you look at actually the distribution of those scores? So you can get the same average from a normally distributed set of scores as you can from, say, a binodally distributed set of scores, which would reflect very different preferences for a particular value. One where everyone's kind of met, and the one where there's really strongly held views on both sides. So they look the same if you just look at the average, but actually, that is really hard, distinct views. I think.
So so I'm not sure. I think I might be able to answer this by talking more about the process and kind of fleshing that out a little more.
Sure.
So the process-wise, everyone ranks it, and you picked up on me saying you could rank everything as a 5 or everything as a 1, and that's fine with me as long as we have enough people so that there is some variance. So then it does drive the decision, it drives the dialogue to say, okay, that we have a ranking now, a prioritization. How does that land on you? And then so that's one piece, and then the second piece is stressing that. I think I said it quite late after those slides, is stressing that there's going to be values that are in tension in the context that we're addressing, and so the group needs to work through that tension. So even if everyone scored them the same, or even scored it as really important or as whatever, if those are in tension, we have to make sense of that tension and give a rationale for why one is more important than not. So it is forcing a trade-off.
So I think I think the tension that I'm thinking about is not two values being in tension with one another, but two groups of people having strong views one way or another for the same value, which would then end up scoring potentially, being ranked somewhere that's similar once you score it to a value that people are broadly in agreement on, where it's in the middle.
So what you're saying, everyone understood.
So you have one value where everyone answers, half of them answer 1 and half of them answer 5.
Yeah.
And then you have another value where everybody answers 3.
Yeah.
And so whatever those values are, how do you distinguish between, how do you then say, well, this value is more important than the other? When it's not down to the value, it's down to the people.
Yeah, so it would be up to those. It would be up to those two groups: the people who said it was a 5 and the people who said it was a 1, to have an argument, basically, to discuss it and make sense of that. And then, as a group, I didn't get into the kind of rules of engagement and how we interact with each other. But at the end of the day, we have to make decisions. That's the process. Isn't about having a conversation. It's about getting to a decision. And so it might end up sometimes that. It's rare, but where we have a vote and just the majority, maybe it wouldn't work. They'd have to convince one other person in this kind of experiment. But if there's a strong disagreement, that's a big sign that there's something going on here. And it also is a sign that maybe are all these people from one specialty and all these other ones from a different specialty, and we need to make some sense of how, because they now need to work together and make a decision. So I hear your concern. I don't know if I really addressed it, but practically that's how I would work.
It's a deliberative process
on
top of that, I guess, is what I understand. So then, okay, so who casts the time vote?
So just to, I don't know if this is really helpful, but one of the other things in that first step that I didn't get into because I felt like maybe it was a bit too mundane, but it's really critical, is setting up those expectations at the very beginning. So how are we going to interact with each other? Because we are going to disagree. If no one's in disagreement, we probably get the mix at the table wrong, or this decision doesn't warrant this much time and energy.
Yeah.
So how are we going to interact with each other? And there's a bunch of guidance on how, and then there's choices that people can commit as a group, commit to around kind of how are we going to, if we don't agree, what are we going to do? And for the most part, we get to procedural consensus, or even consensus usually, but at least procedural consensus where people are kind of, it's the right process and the right stuff happened and the right people were consulted. So I don't like the policy, but it's good, it's fine. But usually we get to consensus and rarely we get to a vote, or even rarer than that, a leader, a senior person weighing in and saying we're going to do X instead of Y.
That's really interesting that there is that ability for the senior leader to sort of step in and say, okay, we can't get.
Yeah.
So in the process, do you seek to get that senior leader to say, these are the organisation's values that are leading me to make this direction, essentially? Is that what you do? How does that play?
Just before I answer that, because you brought up something else that's interesting, is that part of the reason for going through this process and bringing the structure is it's obviously to get to the best decision possible, but part of that is around flattening power.
Yeah.
So getting people whose voices wouldn't normally be heard into the decision making, so that in infection control we have the people who clean the rooms involved, so they can give that perspective, which is so critical to a policy around infection control, for example. So ideally, we don't have one person who's at the end of the day that I'm the ED here, and so I'm going to cast the deciding vote and say which way we'll go. But there are also situations where that's quite reasonable. There's one person who is very accountable for whatever this is. They carry the accountability, and they have the responsibility to make the decision at the end of the day. So I just wanted to add that piece.
That's really great.
Yeah, but then, Chris, to what you were asking, do you mind just refreshing me so I answer it properly?
So it's so I like all of these things. I think flatten organisations, everybody's values, getting a voice. In those circumstances where you can't get to a consensus, people strongly hold different views or different values. Do you then turn to explicit statements of the organisation's values to help break that, or senior representatives who are assumed to be expressing the organisation's values? Is that something that you do, and how does it work?
Yeah, so that's an interesting scenario set up where if we couldn't come to a resolution or if the group couldn't come to a resolution on the values, that we would then look to the organizational values. And so AHS, for example, has CARES. Yeah. And so we'd look to it and we go, okay, compassion, and how does that fit within here, and how is that going to change the weightings? I haven't done that before. So that's an interesting option. Usually what happens is those values get brought in.
Yeah.
Like they're actively brought in
You can see
already.
them in the discussion.
Yeah, so it's not that they're on the side and then we would pull them in, it's that they're already in the, they're in the active discussions already. Yeah. But it would, yeah, I could imagine a situation where if they're, coming back to it, I haven't had this happen, but where it might be justified to, at the end of the day, have someone weigh in and say, okay, actually, because of things that are going on in the organization right now and some pressures that the kind of cost sustainability, program sustainability pieces, budget impact pieces are going to have to be more important in this context, at least for now until the budget changes or something like that. Yeah. Can I just ask someone, who hasn't spoken yet?
Yeah. Thank you. This is very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
So you talk about information collection in your process. And I work with IHD. The IHD we spend a lot of time, money to collect information. But that information most focus on economic information and clinical information, relatively less money for other factors such as equity, patient accessibility, and preference. So my question is, how can we, our information reach out to your member to make a decision making?
Okay, yeah. I love that question because when it comes up, so for example, at one of the CHESPR conferences a few years back now, that was a big topic that was coming up from a lot of speakers who were coming from more kind of the academic side, the research side, and they were saying, how do we get this knowledge, this new information to decision makers in healthcare? And this might be a controversial thing to say, oddly, is because I feel like it does get into the decision making. So the work that you do at IHE gets into the decision making. So we would be looking, for example, potentially on, if one of the examples was around technetium-9. It's around a radioactive product, and there was an expected shortage. I can't remember if it was technetium or another one, but there was an expected shortage when the forget the reactor name. Sorry? Chalk River, thank you. I was going to say Cache Creek. My BC is showing again. But when Chalk River reactor was being decommissioned, and that's a place where that evidence is really useful. So if we have the evidence to say, hey, these other products or these other types of diagnostics are this effective, or whether better or worse in terms of effectiveness, clinical effectiveness, and cost effectiveness as well, that's really, really useful in informing the decisions. So it's and it's something that in the work I'm involved in anyways, that we seek out, that we're desperate for, we're hungry for that kind of information.
Okay, if there are some bias, because of all information focused on economic and clinical, but how about other factors such as equity?
Yeah, so I don't know if this will exactly answer, but hopefully partly is when I'm talking about, so to come back to the conceptual piece about kind of there's the facts, there's the information, which is one part of the foundation of making a decision, and then there's the values as well. They're interrelated, that there's a relationship there where if someone says, so for example, patient safety is really important to me, my follow-up would be, well, what do we know about the patient safety context within this decision we're making? Like, what information do we have there? And so if there was, say, an HTA that had clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness in it, what does that tell us? Or if we're looking at that kind of evidence, it's probably telling us, or we have to react to how important is cost effectiveness and how important is the clinical effectiveness in this decision. So there's a kind of relationship back and forth between facts and values, in my opinion. So that, I guess, is hopefully answers your question, sort of. Thank you.
Are we supposed to finish at 1?
At 3, yeah.
We have the room, though. We can
At the room. Okay.
If anyone needs to leave, my feelings won't be hurt. I'll just say that right now, that's totally fine, I get it. But if you do have more questions, I'm happy to have a chat. This is really useful for me too, to have kind of some different perspectives and some smart minds talking about this process.
A real softball question, which is, how does it feel to give a talk on ethics with a halo
Is there?
on your head?
I hope there's a screenshot.
How do you deal with uncertainty?
In what context and like what type of uncertainty?
When the evidence is uncertain.
Yeah.
So your facts are, you get the evidence and those are the facts, but you know, that's sample information. So there's there's a degree of unknownness or uncertainty about what the facts tell you.
Yeah.
How do you talk about uncertainty to the group and get them to take a view on what weight they attach to the uncertainty in the evidence, or their attitude to uncertainty? Because you can have a value, you can have a risk attitude. Is that something that you do or you've seen others do?
Yeah, so in terms of the first piece, which in terms of uncertainty about evidence, let me come back to that. In terms of uncertainties about risk, that comes up a lot. It comes up a lot, especially in the clinical level. So worrying about patients making decisions that might put themselves or others at risk, or worrying about care providers making decisions that might put themselves or their patients or whoever at risk, and the kind of severity and probability of risk, and trying to flesh out our understandings, where often kind of in the same way that we talk about patient safety often, or that's like we as kind of health system folks, is it's very broad and ambiguous, and risk also is spoken about in the same way. As often it's kind of put out and said that's too high of a risk, and we don't kind of pause and say, like, let's break this out, and how bad would it be, and how probable is it actually going to come. So that comes up a lot, and so that's a really valuable conversation to have with groups. I find it really useful to kind of have a richer understanding of risk. The piece around uncertainty of evidence, that's interesting that you brought it up, and I think it's probably something that I need to get better at, or that we need to get better at. We don't tackle it in a kind of rigorous way. Certainly not with the kind of rigor that I think you folks would when you're looking at evidence. We would look at it and go, oh, this is kind of, exactly, and exactly along those, so in a much less rigor. Do you have a suggestion of what's that?
We do more of that than we
well, thanks for that. But if you had suggestions of how to practically handle that in a kind of decision-making context.
So there's a discipline sort of part, it's at the interface of statistics and psychology, called elicitation of expert judgment, where you're getting people to express their subjective characterization of the uncertainty. So they really, you give them what the evidence says, but they bring expertise and experience and stuff that's not in the published literature to bear on their interpretation, and you get them to express their subjective uncertainty, both what the expectation is, the expected value, the mean, but also what the range that it could be, and put that into the discussion and ask the question. We often ask the question: is that level of uncertainty such that we'd like to get a bit more evidence before making a final decision? Is the uncertainty here so large and sufficiently important to us? So again, it's in the importance weighting as well, that we would want to capture some more evidence before we make a definitive decision. So we'll sort of have we'll do this for now, but we're going to monitor and try and learn more and come back and review this subsequently. Or you find, no, we're happy, that's certainly enough, we don't need to monitor, we don't need to worry about it. So it's sort of that subjective probabilistic information that we can get out. And that's not routine or regular, it's kind of the cutting edge of what we're trying to do for the smarter people in the health economics and the evaluation space that they're trying to do. Bayesian statisticians have been doing it for decades. So where the US puts its nuclear waste storage based upon that sort of process, because no one knows really. And so they did this with nuclear physicists, like 1,000 plus nuclear physicists were taken through this sort of process about the risk of leakage if you store it in different sorts of geological conditions. So
it's very interesting. Can I just ask, Nicole, is anyone still online?
2 people.
Okay. I don't think they'd mind if I sat down.
No.
Feels a little awkward now. Thanks for that, Chris. Yeah, that's interesting. I'll look it up. Yeah.
Yeah, great talk. I guess I was just thinking about attended some CADIF and panel discussion around conflict of interest.